welcome to this conversation with Gopalkrishna Gandhi, who has been a Meera and Vikram Gandhi Fellow at the Center for Contemporary South Asia of late. I am Ashutosh Varshney. I direct the Center for Contemporary South Asia, located at the Watson Institute. And it's been really a pleasure to host him. Gopal Gandhi is a scholar, an administrator, a diplomat. He started his career as an IS officer, Indian Administrative Service Officer, and served for 25 years. His ambassadorial appointments significantly include his term as India's High Commissioner to South Africa when Nelson Mandela was president. And his published works include a novel, a play, a major translation, and several other works of non-fiction, The Oxford Gandhi, Gandhi in Bengal, My Dear Bapu, The Death Penalty, etc. His own career has been a brilliant one, but an important biographical detail is that he is Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, and his time here at the Watson Institute, at our center, was spent looking at some materials on Mahatma Gandhi that have not been investigated thoroughly by scholars. So, Gopal, welcome to this conversation, and may I start with a question that is on everyone's mind. Gandhi has been written about, researched so much. Perhaps one of the most extensively studied figures of modern world history. He's been written about so much. What else is there to know?
The reason why he has been written about as much as he has been written about is that he has written very little about himself. He has been very spare in his autobiographical observations. What he has written, and he wrote extensively, is about matters beyond his own life, is about what was happening around him, both to society and to politics, and to what can be called the human condition. But he didn't speak too much about himself. And his deeds, his action, his work in the world on terra firma was far ahead of his written work on himself, which is why so many have found the need to bridge the gap between his actions, which speak for themselves, but speak in a language which is the language of real activity, different from the language of self-description. So he has fascinated people. Had his words been this much and his work been this much, I don't think anybody would have looked at him.
Right. So it is often said that Gandhi sought a very deep integration between his inner life and his actions in the public realm. That the public and private for him were deeply integrated. Is that a fair assessment?
It is fair. It is fair to him. It is also fair to the issue of inner and outer, of internal and external. The fact that he set out at a very young age, before he was quite 20, to be by himself in Britain, a student, when there were not so many students of Indian origin in Britain, can start an analysis of what you have just described, because he was suddenly in the hush of solitude, seclusion perhaps is a better word than solitude, which conduced to introspection. And then he analyzed all that had happened to his life in the first 18-19 years before he had come to Britain, which included what he has himself described as a child marriage. He had and his wife had lost a child, and they had this very young son who was still in the home, family home. And so here is this incredibly young father, incredibly young husband, and then he says, I'm in London, no wife, no children, no parents, all the time in the world, and that led to reflection. It could have led to something else, it could have led to dissolution, but it led to reflection in his case. And to certain examinations of life in India, of life in the imperial world, and also in Britain, which he saw very positively at that time as the home where Latin is learnt, law is learnt, examples of public spiritedness are seen, and he sees these two characters, Charles Bradlaugh, an atheist, which does not attract him, but Charles Bradlaugh also the uncompromising champion of Indian independence, of Indian self-respect, of Indian dignity, which attracts him. Independence not in the sense of Poorna Swaraj, a complete independence which became Gandhi's ideal, but independence in the sense of large political autonomy, of a kind of release from Britain. And then he sees Dadabhai Nauroji, the grand old man of India as he later came to be called, Parsi from Bombay, Gujarati speaking like him, but passionately devoted to two things, to the British form of justice, to the British form of legislature, and also to India's self-respect. And so these two streams came together. How can India be a model example of constitutional, legally organized life, and also be true to itself and be independent? And this is what really led to all that you have described as the outer, springing from his inner.
Correct me if I'm wrong, the autobiography that he wrote, I think, came right up to 1924?
Yes.
23 or 24?
Yes.
Yeah.
Around that time.
Are your materials going to be about the period, let's say, from 1869 when he was born to 1924, or your materials, or the book that you plan to write, you will be covering the period after 1924-25 until his death in 1948?
That distinction is not very sharp, because he wrote letters from very early on, some of which have been lost to time, but he wrote extensively letters and also journals and diaries, which didn't go into his autobiography. They belong to the period which his autobiography does cover, but still they remain outside the fold of his autobiography. And they contain a great deal of what can be called new insights on known facts. These are not discoveries. These are new appraisals of what already exists. New not because they have been discovered anew, but because they have not been shown the light of fresh investigation. For instance, his conversations with his first biographer in South Africa, Joseph J. Doak, predate his autobiography. His autobiography describes the circumstances of his birth, of his childhood, but his conversations
and
with
time
Doak,
in England also.
time in England, time in South Africa, time in
Africa.
early years in India.
Right.
But his descriptions of his own childhood to Doak, in his own words, in Gandhi's own words, as quoted by Doak, are very different from his own descriptions of it in his own words in the book. Not that they differ materially, but there are things. For instance, he says that a great feast was held by his father on the date of his birth. And then he also says that his father fixed the date of his naming, the Namakarana, by consulting an astrologer. And that astrologers chanced upon the letter Ma for his first name. And so I became Mohandas. Gandhi does not say, and it is not for him to say, it is for us who dabble in coincidences, to say that the letter Ma was going to figure as a prefix to Gandhi, not as Mohandas, but as Mahatma. So the astrological coincidence is curious. Doesn't mean that astrology is a subject Gandhi was fond of. No, he was not. But he mentions this. Coming to South Africa, the things which he has mentioned in his autobiography are what can be called the landmarks. But then...
May I just interrupt for a second?
Yes,
for
of course.
Our audience? The South African years were 1893
Yes.
to 1915, I think.
1914 is when he left, but you could say 15.
Yeah,
yes.
right. So roughly 21 to 22 years of his life
yes.
was spent in South
Yes,
Africa.
yes.
I might also remind our viewers that when Nelson Mandela was asked by Time magazine to write an article on Mahatma Gandhi, Mandela said Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas K. Gandhi, was both South African and Indian.
Yeah, you're right. He said that. He quoted Gandhi when he said that. Gandhi saying that I was born in India but made in South Africa. That was a very true statement. That is also true personally and politically, because he really got to understand what Mandela himself described later as the technique of disciplined mass protest. Disciplined mass protest. Both words, discipline and mass, were very important for Mandela. If there is no discipline, the mass protest will fail. And if it is not a mass protest, the discipline is a weak impulse. So Mandela understood Gandhi extremely well. And there is a link between Mandela and Gandhi which often escapes us. This is the kind of thing which the study which Brown has enabled me to do will help me to understand. There was this extraordinary Gujarati speaking Indian figure called Yusuf Dadu. He was a leading light of the Communist Party. He is post Gandhi in South Africa. But Yusuf Dadu comes to India and meets Gandhi at the height of the Bihar riots in 1946 from South Africa. And Gandhi interacts with him extensively, and Dadu goes back and becomes one of the early colleagues of Mandela. So there is somebody, a human bridge between Gandhi and Mandela, which reinforced that understanding between the two. Dadu and Naikar and Zuma were three doctors. One, a West Indian, Gujarati speaking, happens to be Muslim, Yusuf Dadu. The other, Monty Naikar, Tamil speaking doctor, and Dr. Zuma. It's African. So they call the Doctors' Pact, and they really symbolized together the extraordinarily inclusive is not a word which Gandhi used, but extraordinarily integrated vision of Gandhi, which was active in India and South Africa together.
So the book that you're writing will include these facets of Gandhi's life which have escaped scholarly and biographical attention.
That is
instances of this kind, about which many of us who read a lot by Gandhi and on Gandhi are unfamiliar.
That is an accurate description of what I am attempting, but I should also say that fresh perspectives and perceptions of Gandhi through Gandhi's own life will continue to be discovered and written about all the time. There will never be a time when the saga of Gandhi has been saturated, because he interacted with literally thousands of people, and those thousands of people each has a story to narrate which is entirely historical and which says something about the period. And so the story of Gandhi will never be completely written. There will always be a time when people are writing afresh about Gandhi, of course with new criticisms of Gandhi, new points to raise with Gandhi, new objections to make on Gandhi's life, but always with something suddenly becoming curious and interesting, and this will never end. And I think the story of Gandhi, because it's not just of his life but the life of his times and the life of his colleagues and the life of his adversaries, is so rich, so completely replete, like somebody said, a pomegranate that holds its ruby seeds.
The angle, the primary angle that you'll be using or deploying in this book is biographical and about inner life or personal life, or and of course we know that the inner life and inner and the outer were integrated in his life, or would you be also focusing on some facets of his public life in the public realm, which require, according to you, fresh investigation or fresh perspective?
Yes, I would try to do that, Professor Varshney. I must also say that what fascinates me about him is the extraordinary self-criticism that emerges from so many of his observations and writings, autobiographical, hugely self-critical. They serve him very ill who place him on a pedestal. Those who suggest a kind of elevatedness to him, those who suggest something more, a kind of immaculacy to him, do him great wrong. For he was a highly fallible, flawed and constantly self-critical person. And he said, I am open to criticism all the time. And he subjected himself to that. I find his autobiographical statements which analyze himself, which speak of himself with great disapproval, the most fascinating things about him.
In this vein, can we talk about the famous relationship or the between the son and the father? It's often said, and I think rightly, that all difficult fathers are not great, but all great fathers are difficult. They demand a lot of their children. And what is it that if that's something of interest to you, and either for this book or otherwise, what is it about his relationship with, I think, the oldest son, and correct me there if I'm wrong, which led to a great deal of disaffection, tension, and almost, or perhaps literally, a breakup between the father and the son?
The eldest son, you're right, is the son with whom he had a difficult relationship. And this needs to be seen in the context of the lives of both. When the son is only 17 years younger than yourself, there is a difference. So when Harilal is 18, 19, 20, when he begins to see his father, he sees his father as somebody who is himself barely out of his teens, and he sees him very much through his mother's eyes, which is very natural, and constantly sees him through his mother's eyes as a person of the same age as his mother, incidentally, struggling with himself, with his own inner conflicts, with his own sense of responsibilities as a husband and as a father, and his growing sense of public responsibilities. Gandhi is deeply admiring of his eldest son Harilal, with very good reason, and this is something which is not so well known.
Yes.
And I am not saying this with some kind of with the smugness or the self-satisfaction or self-congratulation of a discovery. No, this is well documented, but not probably well appreciated. That in South Africa, Gandhi deployed his son in the first satyagraha, and Harilal went to jail in South Africa before Gandhi went to jail, and spent more days in prison in South Africa than Gandhi did. And Gandhi says, famously in a letter which deserves to be better known, I am proud of Harilal. Every Indian should do what Harilal has done. By every Indian, he meant every Indian in South Africa. So this is the Harilal whom he starts with. But this is also the Harilal who has married the love of his life against his parents' wishes. Hats off to him. He not only marries the girl he wants to marry, whose family, incidentally, the Gandhi family knew, because they were also from the same town. He insists on bringing her home to South Africa, and does. And of course, everybody is immediately completely taken up with Gulab, as she was called. But he wants to lead his own life according to his own lights, and his lights coincide and diverge from the father. There are other episodes.
What is the big? What would be the 2 or 3 biggest differences between the father and the oldest son?
Circumstantial to start with. Harilal wants to study, a perfectly legitimate desire, and he studies his father's studies, in the sense he knows that his father has spent 3 years in London learning law, learning Latin, reading the great libraries, books. So he says, I want to also do law in London. Please send me there. Especially when a family friend, a benefactor, says to Gandhi in South Africa, please send one of your sons, I will educate him at my expense. And Gandhi does not send Harilal. He sends a nephew, but not his son.
And what is Gandhi's reason?
Reason is not completely explained by him, but we can now see. Reasons are this. Harilal is married. He has a family to rear. He knows his sons. He is not sure how Harilal will fare in England as a student. He does not want his son to flop as a student, and more than that, to get into difficulties which would spoil his family. He knows his sons. But his nephew he does not feel will do the same. But circumstances, Professor Varshney, extraordinary. His nephew goes and is an utter failure as a student, and he comes back. And when he comes back, Harilal says, so Chaganlal didn't work. Now send me. He says again, no, and sends one of his most valued colleagues, a young Parsi, Saurabji Adajania, who is brilliant and does very well. So rankling. Here's an opportunity.
This is
circumstantial,
yeah.
But then also interlaced with what can be called personality differences. And remember, as I said, it's just a 17-year difference. It's what can be called a talking difference. you can have a conversation with somebody who's just 17, 20 years ago as an equal in a way in which you can't when somebody is 30 years old.
Have you also, and this is not about a family dispute or difference of a very profound sort, have you also had a chance to look at Gandhi's great differences with Subhash Chandra Bose?
Yeah. I'm delighted that you should ask this question close on the heels of your question about Harilal, because the similarities between the two are extraordinary.
I see.
In the sense, not that Harilal and Subhash were similar, but that the equations were very similar. Here is a estranged son in Harilal, and here is an estranged colleague in Subhash. Very promising. Harilal and Subhash have this in common. Jawaharlal is Gandhi's clearly designated heir. And Subhash says, what is wrong with me? And he shows it, that he carries the party with him and wins. Gandhi is a Democrat. He has to be. He can't be otherwise. But he also has this sense of the future of the Congress being secure in the hands of the Congress president. And he and his colleagues see in Subhash a person who is going to lead the Congress according to his own judgment, according to his own light. Fascinating as he is, charismatic as he is, deeply honest as he is, but yet an independent light. And they're not sure whether non-violence, as Gandhi believes in, ahimsa as he calls it, will be Subhash's priority. They're also not sure whether constitutionalism will be his priority. So a third way is probably Subhash's way, and they are not sure about the third way.
But the third way was not a commitment to militant, violent action to get rid of the British from India? Or had he made a commitment to that, or not made a commitment to that?
That is an important observation and links again to what we talked about Harilal. Gandhi knew his sons. Gandhi knew his colleagues. He could sense the thingness in them, what really prompts them, what really propels them, what makes them what they are. And I think he saw in Subhash negatively what he saw in Jawaharlal positively, which was charisma. He says very often that Jawaharlal is young. He appeals to the youth. He will carry the youth of India. He also believes, though he has not said it in as many words, that the future of India lies with somebody like Jawaharlal, who belongs to the young generation, to the new generation, to the future. Why did he not think the same of Subhash? He is also young.
Yes.
He is also dynamic. He also appeals to the youth. But why this difference?
Why?
Very curious. I think he saw in Jawaharlal somebody who would tame his fire and link it to the national cause. In Subhash, I think he saw a raging fire which could perhaps consume itself and not illuminate the struggle. These are all hypotheses which can be matched against the written word, but this is what he was: a master analyst of the human character, beginning with himself, beginning with his own depreciation of himself as a person who can make mistakes. I think Subhash's implicit devotion to Gandhi, which he himself expressed many times, and the author of the phrase father of the nation, Subhash. It is he who called him father of the Indian nation. But then why? Harilal and Subhash are the two great questions of Gandhi's personal and political judgment, which will always show him up in a deservedly unfavorable light. Deservedly unfavorable, because it is not explicable in rational terms.
And so long as we are on this theme, and perhaps you've thought about this, and you must have. The third big, widely noted dispute of Gandhi's is with Ambedkar. And of late I have read quite a lot about it, especially on whether caste system should be eliminated entirely or simply untouchability fought, whether the elimination of the caste system, whether the caste system can be reformed as opposed to requiring elimination, whether Hinduism itself is to be destroyed, as Ambedkar argued, actually, in Annihilation of Caste, in order for caste system to go. And Gandhi's claim, no, that's not necessary. Now, the question that I'm not sure any biographer has answered well, and if it's been answered well, tell us, that, and our audience, that's been answered. The hypothesis is that despite the differences between Gandhi and Ambedkar, Ambedkar perhaps would not have been appointed the chair of the drafting committee of India's constitution without the approval of Gandhi or Nehru. It was such an important position to hold. It was arguably the most important committee of the Constituent Assembly. Arguably, we could say there are other committees that were also as important, or perhaps more. But I think arguably it would be fair to say that the drafting committee was there. Now, what do we know about this? Gandhi was alive in 46 when the Constituent Assembly started its work, and I think the drafting committee was set up October 46 and November 46, maybe a little earlier, but around that time. And was Gandhi involved in that decision to make Ambedkar the chair of the drafting committee of the Constitution?
There is no doubt that those concerned, President of the Constituent Assembly, Nehru, would have consulted Gandhi on all these matters. There is no doubt at all.
There is no doubt.
Not only about the constitution of the drafting committee, the entrusting of that task and the role of the chief of the drafting committee to Baba Saheb, but also the subsequent appointment of him as a law minister. These are things which, without doubt, had been discussed with Gandhi. And I would not say that Gandhi was responsible for it, though there are others who have said it. And this is something which is probably true, but is not so important as another fact, an allied fact, which is that Gandhi saw very clearly the extraordinary genius of Ambedkar. He saw that this man had it in him to place the Constitution of India on its tracks, from two personal experiences. One was the experience of being at the second roundtable conference in London in 1931, with Ambedkar also present, when they differed sharply, but enabled Gandhi to see that here was a man who knew everything that needed to be known on the subject of constitutional reforms. And then during his own parleys with Ambedkar in the Poona discussions, which led to the Poona Pact, when they clashed, but they clashed to finally converge, and converge constructively, to forge an agreement which found expression in the Constitution of India.
Yes, reserved constituencies clearly come from that.
That's right.
There is the reserved constituencies of India's constitution, reserved SC constituency, Dalit constituencies, where only Dalits would run for office, but everyone would vote. These would be general constituencies, but reserved as opposed to separate constituencies. This is a direct legacy of the Poona Pact. There is no doubt about that.
It is. And I think it also was the opportunity for Gandhi to understand at first hand that the person may have differed from him, but this is a person in whose hands the drafting of the Constitution of India would be not just safe, but would be hugely productive. And there was zero ego in the circles, Congress circles, when it came to the Constitution. They knew where the interests of the future of India lay. And Ambedkar's being given that position was not so much to recognize Ambedkar, but to recognize the sheer interest of the future of India and of the drafting procedure itself. And it has to be said to Ambedkar's credit that once he became head of the drafting committee and the whole of the Constitution became his responsibility, he secured his priority, which was social justice, but went beyond to a whole universe of India's political requirements, which included, subsumed, and went beyond the requirements of the depressed classes. So that possibility to widen his vision, to embrace a much larger concern for the future of India, political, legal, economic, legislative and judicial, that was best served. And I think it was Gandhi's again his ability to see the quality of the person and match that person to the occasion that did it.
One final question. You've spent a lot of time in Kolkata as, among other things, or principally, or most significantly for this discussion, as governor. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee was in Nehru's first cabinet and was, of course, elected to the Constituent Assembly. That has nothing to do with Gandhi per se. Was Gandhi consulted on that? Did Gandhi approve of Shyama Prasad Mukherjee in any way which facilitated the inclusion of Mukherjee into Nehru's first cabinet?
We should probably reconstruct that question or that circumstance, to say that had Gandhi disapproved of the idea, it would not have happened. Had Gandhi had severe objections to somebody like Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, Nehru would not have included him. But it was clear that Gandhi did not have that objection. But much more than an individual being in or not being in, what is important and what is so telling about those times is that Gandhi and the working committee of the Congress, in which he was not part, wanted to give the first cabinet a national composition. They wanted to carry the country with them, Hindu, Muslim, all together, the depressed classes. They wanted to make it as broad-based as possible, which does not mean that they couldn't have found people from these communities from within the ranks of the Congress, but then they would have been congressmen. But they wanted to go beyond and open the doors of the cabinet, of the Council of Ministers, to the whole country, so that nobody felt that the independence of India was a patent held by the Congress. They wanted it to be a new dawn for the whole country.
And therefore, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee's ideological predilections are, in a way, you're saying, are welcome, because a particular political stream of the country is being brought in inclusively at the highest table. And whatever his arguments are, those arguments would be heard by whoever is at that table. And a lot of very important minds are there, and very powerful political figures are there. So he would express his opinions and his viewpoints, and they would be considered. And this would be a way to bring in that political stream inclusively.
Absolutely right. I would just round that off by saying that Gandhi particularly, and also to a very large extent Nehru, saw the ideal of a joint family running India as an ideal to live for and to die for. Had they not, they probably would have had a more cohesive cabinet. But it is far better, in the perspective of time, for them to have tried to be ideally and failed, than to have been narrowly and succeeded narrowly. You started with Mandela, and I'd like to round off by Mandela and say that the great phrase which Mandela used for South Africa, the new South Africa, as the rainbow nation, that concept of India as a rainbow nation, they didn't use the phrase, they didn't know it, but it was that. It was the multi-textured fabric of India that they wanted to weave on the loom of the Constitution.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening conversation. And it was a pleasure to host you at Brown, at the Watson Institute, at the Center for Contemporary South Asia. And we truly, truly look forward to the book.
Thank you. I deeply appreciate the chance.